I mentioned to you that we are in a troubled world, and we are very much in a troubled world, despite the hope that one must keep alive. And it reminded me of a very old, very old Russian joke that most of you will not remember, because as I look around here, you were not around unless you heard it from your fathers or grandfathers. And this, the joke now can be extended, unfortunately, to America or to the Europeans on account of the European Union's backsliding or crisis. And the joke went like this. The not forgotten Leonid Brezhnev woke up one morning and he saw all the problems around the Soviet Union, and his colleagues couldn't help. They didn't have a good idea for him. So he decided that even though he was an atheist, that he would turn to God. So he looked up to where he thought God was and says, "Dear God, dear Lord, I need some help." And so the Lord surprisingly replied, "Well, what can I tell you, my son?" And so he said, "Will my troubles ever end?" And so the answer came back in a few seconds, and the answer was "da" in Russian. Yes, they will. So Brezhnev felt encouraged, and so he says, "May I ask you a second question?" And the answer was again yes, and so he did. He says, "But when will my troubles end?" And there was some silence, then the good Lord replied, "Not in my lifetime." Unfortunately, in this world, I also believe that our troubles will end because dictators come and go, social moods change, the politics of this country or that will change, and backsliding, as in Poland this time, I think will come to an end. And Personally, I don't even believe that Trump will be elected and America will bounce back and will resume the march towards equality, about which I will talk in just a moment. But if you ask me, but yes, Professor Gati, this is all very nice to give us this hopeful talk, but when will it end? Because we have been living through this, whether you come from Russia, then for quite a few years, or you come from Poland, it's now a year, or whatever. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. So what do I know? Let me stick to that. And I will start here discussing now the United States, which is my assignment from Lena. I will start here with a story, as I like to, and it happens to be true, even though I make up lots of stories for my students and my children and grandchildren, but this happens to be a true story. I left Hungary after the Soviet intervention in 1956, and I ended up in the United States, where I went to school. I was at Indiana University, right in the heart of the United States. And in the spring of 1958, some of my new friends there asked if I'd like to spend a week with them. And I asked where they were going and why. And during the spring vacation, the spring recess, they went like so many hundreds of thousands of American university students. They went to Fort Lauderdale, quote unquote, where the girls are, because the spring vacation was a time for boys and girls from colleges and universities to go to the beach in Fort Lauderdale and have fun. So this certainly appealed to me. I was 22 years old at the time, and no, I was already 23. And so I said, sure, well, let's go. My English was not so good, but I know how to swim on the beach and drink beer and a little conversation. Who knows what else might happen? Well, on the way, we got into a big car in Bloomington, Indiana, and somebody drove. We had to stop once on the way to Fort Lauderdale, and the place was somewhere in Georgia, in some little town. In Georgia, we stopped at a motel there. And never in my life will I forget the shock that I saw there with the neon light. This is 1958, probably in March or April. And the neon sign said, forgive me for the expression, but I quote, this is a quote, "No niggers, no Jews, no dogs." 1958, America. That is, I hasten to add, this was part of America. Even in Bloomington, Indiana, which was, Indiana was not then or now a particularly liberal state, but nothing like this could have happened there, let alone in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Boston. Indeed, most parts of the United States, this could not have happened. But it did happen, and I saw that, and it stayed with me. And it serves me today as the essential background to explain to you what happened, what has happened since then. Notably, what's happened in the critical year of 1964, 1965. Years for you to remember and perhaps to do research on in case you are students, because that was the year when, legally speaking, not necessarily culturally, but culture often follows the law, but legally the United States began to change in a dramatic and I would say revolutionary way. Well, what happened then? This was just after the awful assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson came from the South, from Texas, and he was a very powerful politician. He came from a segregationist background, but he was a member of the Democratic Party, which at that time was not like the Democratic Party today. It was quite different, and in the South in particular, the Democratic Party stood for no change at all. He was part of that tradition, but somehow or another, under the influence of the assassination of Kennedy, and in part because of the enormous influence of the new civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, he changed his mind. It's an example of how circumstances and an individual's conscience can make a difference. So he introduced the most wide-ranging legislation in American history under the general term of Great Society. And that included, above all, equality at long last to blacks who could at least obtain the right to vote. Believe me, this is how bad it was that that had to be legislated. And then in the next 30 or 40 years, what he started continued with a great number of extraordinary achievements in American society. Women who did have the vote at that time, but did not have equality. And now I would say they are very close or getting close to that. Some of you may argue that it's not close enough, but given what I saw when I went to America, believe me, the changes have been extraordinary. There was a time, my wife, who's modestly sitting there in the corner, was in the 1990s an assistant secretary of state, working under President Clinton's leadership. And since the title said Assistant Secretary of State, it was one of the top positions in the United States Department of State. And yet when he went abroad, not so much in the United States, I believe, he went abroad, and some people that she had to negotiate with believed that she was a secretary, because that is what women were supposed to be. So even in the United States, things took time, long time. I didn't tell the story right?
That's what Adrian thought.
And even our daughter believed that. Now there you go. That's really getting bad. she was no secretary, for sure. She was a big deal, and remains, to me at least, today as well. So the changes started with blacks, continued with women, maybe concurrently, and continues to this day for homosexuals. A very big movement, and not easy to achieve, but it is there. Now, in addition to that, something that is very current in the United States today, new immigration laws were enacted. The immigration laws had before favored whites from Europe. Today, most of the immigrants to the United States are Mexicans, Chinese, and Koreans. These are the top three. These are extraordinary changes, and of course, it all culminated in the election and re-election of President Obama. Now, the point that I am trying to get to here is that this was not easy, nor unanimous, but the prevailing opinion in the Congress, in the press, very important in America, the press, and elsewhere supported these actions. That doesn't mean that there were no losers. There are, in politics, there are always losers when there are gainers. You cannot have a march to freedom without some groups or some people feeling or actually experiencing significant losses. Who lost? Well, to understand that why it was white males in particular who felt down, you have to keep in mind that to bring about the kinds of changes, particularly for blacks, we had what was called affirmative action. Now, I don't know if you know this expression, but perhaps some of you from the early Russian experience, or for that matter, the early East European experience after World War II, and maybe even later, might recall, I don't know the word for it, the favor the regime provided to young people, men or women, of proletarian background. It was a way to bring, to change the elite, in effect, to change the elite. Affirmative action was not that different, nor was it easy. To admit to colleges and universities students who might not have qualified as well as whites did, but admit them because we needed to change society and do justice at long last. Now, you may say, well, you're young and you are hopeful, and you know, what's the big deal about it? Well, I remember serving at a university on the admissions committee. And we had these piles of applicants, and at that time we were allowed to know. Now we couldn't, who was black and who was not. And you know, we were under the impression that as responsible members of society, if everything else is more or less okay, we should take a black applicant over a white applicant. Now, you may say that was right, or you may say that was wrong. At times I had my doubts because I knew that if I take, or if I recommend to the school that they admit a student who is black but who might not be able to do the work in some courses, I'm doing injustice, both to the applicant and certainly to the student, as well as to the white applicant who didn't get in. And yet we were caught up in this momentum that equality of races mattered a great deal. And so I think in every case I voted to admit what I considered to be a less perfect applicant to school because I wanted to make up for slavery and for the treatment that blacks had had in American society in the 19th and much of the 20th centuries as well. Now, this is the background to the Trump phenomenon, that for 50 years that the whites quietly tolerated a revolution in American society. They tolerated it because it was the prevailing opinion. It was the consensus. Intelligent people, for sure, understood that this had to be done, that it was time for women and blacks and any Hispanics and maybe today, I don't know, I don't serve on admissions committee, so I don't know if we know who is gay or who is not. Well, that it's time to make up for the past. But if you are at the losing end of this proposition, do you feel the same way? Well, you don't. And Donald Trump is giving voice to that minority in American society, uneducated, largely uneducated whites, who simply say enough is enough. 50 years since 1964, American society, in effect, practiced inequality in order to achieve equality. That's not so easy. And I tended to overlook it. I wanted to overlook it because it was not something that, because my feelings were that we should move ahead. There is what we have now is a white backlash in America. Now that in itself does not totally explain what's happening. There are some other words I can use. We can discuss it more. These people feel, believe it or not, that they are humiliated, that they don't count very much, because an uneducated white male still 50, 60 years ago had a better chance to get a job and to keep a job despite the lack of education than blacks who might have had education and might have a bit more promising prospects for that position. They feel they are victims. They are victims of an elite-imposed system of processes that they did not like. Now, these people had a voice in American society before, and I could talk to you about perhaps far away or not so important candidates for president. Pat Buchanan certainly was one of them. But he had a marginal effect on American politics. He would get 10%. He did win one in New Hampshire, as I recall. I may be mistaken, but either he won a primary for the presidency or he came in second. So it's not that the phenomenon is totally new. It is not totally new, but nobody has been able to voice it as effectively as he has, as Trump has. Now, one more point on this. Personally, I don't believe he's going to win the election. I'm going to stick my neck out here, but as of today, his chances of winning are 40%, and Hillary Clinton's chances are about 60%, according to not just polls, but the various models that in the past proved to be accurate. I'm referring here, in case you want to check me out on the internet, you can check out Nate Silver's, that's N-A-T-E, Silver's website, which is, the last election, he predicted the result in every one of the 50 states of the United States. So I can't do any better, and I'm just repeating. The chances are 60% that Hillary Clinton will win. It does matter greatly who will win, but I'm still troubled by that 40% chance. Who are these people beyond the educated white males who will vote for Donald Trump? My best estimate is that you have about 25% of the votes in the United States coming from this kind of Tea Party, white backlash kind of vote, who believe that the elites, not just Democrats, but Republicans alike, that they have betrayed them. So where does the other 20% come from? Well, they are Republicans who all their lives have always voted Republican, and they have a very hard time, despite the evidence, not to vote Republican. The evidence being that Trump is not a real Republican. I don't know what he is. He's a demagogue. He lies. But some of his proposals certainly go against Republican views. For example, the view about Russia. He seems to like Comrade Putin. Well, Republicans are among those who dislike, distrust, and oppose Putin more than anything else. The last Republican candidate called Russia the greatest geopolitical threat, not only to the United States, but to the world. So that was 4 years ago. That was Romney. 4 years later, we have a quote-unquote Republican candidate who apparently, is this on?
No.
Republican candidate who feels otherwise, and he believes that that Putin is a strong leader, whatever that means, but that he said it in a positive kind of way. So, but still, you have 20% of the voters who don't know how to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, there are some who do. Just this week in the Washington Post, there was a long list of, I don't know how many, maybe 50, 60, 70 foreign policy experts, former ambassadors of the United States, going back to Harry Truman, who served under Republicans and Democrats alike, and they said they will vote for Hillary Clinton. So there are many. I think the old President Bush supposedly said, I've been on the road, I've been in the Czech Republic, so I'm not as up to date as I should be on this, but supposedly President Bush said that he also, it's not this President Bush, but the old one, that he will vote for Hillary Clinton. There are others, many others, who either will not vote or will not vote for Donald Trump. So the Republicans are divided, but still there is this 20%. This is what makes up. Now, those are not white backlash type Republicans necessarily. Some may be, but they don't feel that they can vote for a Democrat, especially because Hillary Clinton has lots of things against her. So, to sum it up, American society is in the process of a counter-revolution against the social changes and economic changes and political changes that have developed since Kennedy dreamed of them, and Lyndon Johnson, with extraordinary political skill, has been able to implement that. One more word here. I just mentioned to you that there is a broad tendency to oppose the elites in American society today. Well, yes and no. There is here some distinction that I'd like to call your attention to. If you ask American voters, are you satisfied with the direction of the country? More than 2/3 will say no. So that supports everything that I have just said. And yet, if you also ask another question, and they do ask that question, do you approve or disapprove of President Obama's presidency? Believe it or not, it's close to 58% who will say yes. Now you say 58%, what's that? Well, believe me, in America, getting 58% after 7.5 years in office is everything. For example, the last Republican president, President Bush, this is the young Bush, I think in the last year of his term in office, had about 23, 24% public support. So Obama is doing very, very well. But Congress is not doing well. That's under 10% approval rating. And generally speaking, the system of governance where money makes so much difference is not doing well. Okay, well, I promised my wife that I will be brief. There is a second point about the support for Trump that I want to discuss, and that has to do with foreign policy. The United States I think not only during the Cold War, but after the Cold War, experienced a phenomenon that could be called the arrogance of power, which is to say, especially militarily, we did more than we should have. There is a reaction to that, and particularly and notably the Iraq war, and to a great extent the war in Afghanistan. I think most people now recognize that that should not have been done. I say I'm very pleased to say that Zbigniew Brzezinski was in the forefront of opposing the war in Iraq, and in some quiet, more or less private ways, so was I. But those who supported it believed that America can walk on water, and that everybody in the world simply wants to adopt or embrace the American view. Now, there is something to that. America does have a great appeal, and just the worrisome comments I picked up here in the last few hours about Trump shows that you do care very much about what happens in America. And why is that so? Because it's the oldest democracy, and it is possible, I don't think it's probable, but I think it is possible that it would elect somebody without any knowledge of how to run a government, somebody who is a demagogue, somebody who is changing his mind within 1 minute of one speech and says the very opposite of that. It's extraordinary. I have to tell you now, by now you know, I've been in the United States and voting there for many decades. I have never encountered anything like this, nor did I ever anticipate this. So what we have now is a backsliding in this respect too, a kind of counter-revolution to an activist America. It's not as clear as in the domestic field, but I think now most Americans are responsive to what Trump says, which is to say, let's take care of ourselves and let's put on the back burner some other activities. Concurrently, the United States is not quite the superpower that it used to be. It is still, in my view, the number one, militarily, economically, but also in terms of soft power. If I ask you to mention, let's say, a film or an actor or an actress, you are very likely to know somebody, a big Hollywood star. You may not know a Chinese one or even a German one or anybody else. America continues to have tremendous influence in the world in popular culture, and as a matter of fact, if I may do a little propaganda here, American universities remain listed by a Chinese think tank as among, in the top 20, more than 10 of the universities are American universities, including Johns Hopkins University. But I will say that also Yale University as well. So America is there, but there is the rise of the rest. Others are catching up. They're not getting there. I mean, China is a very important factor in the world of commerce today. But in so many other ways, it does not approach the power and appeal of the United States. There is, of course, Russia, huge nuclear weapons, and more than that, we see in Syria the display of extraordinary modernization of the Russian Air Force. But you know, it does not come to what the United States still is in the world, but it is not what it used to be. The American reaction to that, which I believe is understood better by Trump than by Clinton, the reaction to that is that we should be doing far less than we are doing, and the crowds that come to his gatherings, his speeches, they embrace that, they like that, and at the same time, they believe that it's not our fault, but it's somebody else's fault. There's a lot of scapegoating in American politics. It's the Mexicans, you know, they do this badly or that. We need a wall. And then everybody jumps up and they're very happy that we will have a wall there. As if we didn't remember the Berlin Wall, or we didn't see last year that miserable fence that was built by Hungary right here at the Hungarian-Serbian border. How shameful it is to do that. And of course, they want to change immigration laws that would favor, once again, white Europeans to come to America and in effect bring to an end the diversity that has made America what it is. So what we have here together is domestic backsliding. A strong word for that is counter-revolution on the one hand, as well as foreign policy failures, maybe backtracking, backsliding, just America is not as powerful and influential as it used to be. And at the same time, going with it, a decline that bothers me more than anything else, a decline in the generosity of spirit. I'm very upset when I was in Prague this week when I saw a report on CNN. The number, I think, is accurate, that another boat off of Egypt sank with 160 people there. 30 were saved, but it was unclear where they could go. I mean, they can go to Jordan, they can go to Turkey, but many of them have come to Germany and Sweden. But in Sweden, for example, there is now a stop to this. Other countries don't even pretend to reach out. In Canada, the best in Canada took 25,000, but more than that, the spirit, more than that, Prime Minister Trudeau went to the airport to greet them and make them feel at home. I am embarrassed and greatly troubled that the United States has taken in, I believe, only about 10,000 so far, and perhaps another 10,000 might be coming. Contrast this to what happened to me. In 1957, when I arrived in the United States, I was one of 50,000 Hungarian refugees. 50,000 out of 180,000 of us all together. And what happened was that the initial quota of about 4,500 that was available at the time, that expired, that was done. By the time I got to Vienna, there was no space, no room for me. So President Eisenhower went to the US Congress. At that time, they were still on speaking terms, They were cooperative. And so he got another 44,000 quotas. So I was able to get in there. And I can't tell you how wonderfully Americans of all kinds greeted us and treated us, certainly treated me very, very well indeed. So the changes here are extraordinary. And why this is also maybe just one point beyond those that I have mentioned that I'd like to call your attention to. And that has to do with the internet. Obviously, the internet is wonderful. I use it all the time. But it is not just a blessing. It's also a curse. It gives the impression that every opinion is as good as the next, and that you are entitled to express yourself in terms that are insulting, hostile, and vulgar. If you write something that somebody else doesn't like, you're a traitor, and you should be shot, or your mother should be shot. I was subjected to this because I'm a very strong critic of a political regime here in north of Belgrade. You can guess which one. And I'm also a critic of another one, a larger one, with 40 million people, and there are several people here from Poland. I don't like that either. And so when I write something, and I believe that I know what I'm writing about, the attacks are are very personal, very nasty. In effect, in a Freudian term, the lid is off the id. The hostility, what Freud described as our hostile nature, is now free for all to express, and there are no consequences. In some ways, I preferred the old world where you could still express yourself, but there were some consequences. I don't mean jail consequences, but intellectual consequences. And society was less willing to tolerate uncivilized behavior. Okay, so I am going to stop here because I think my time is up. But I do have to raise the question that I started with, which is to say, am I still hopeless? Well, I'm certainly not hopeless about the United States. Even if I am mistaken and Mr. Trump is elected and those 45% of the people who vote for him will be delighted, I think in 4 years he will be gone and another cycle will start. There's an American historian, Arthur Schlesinger, who wrote about historical cycles and in American history. I don't know if he was quite right about every 25 years America goes this way or that way, but it's not 25 years. But I think this cycle that has now ended, that began in the mid-1960s, I think the new cycle will not last for 50 years. It will come to an end, and we will be able to sing again, "We Shall Overcome." Thank you.